Hi everyone, welcome to Aquatics by Nature. This week I thought I'd address another one of the popular questions in the comments, namely, what filtration do I have in this 28-year-old, no water change, unfertilised aquarium? Filtration is one of those subjects that can be quite a personal thing, and really what I'm going to talk about today is just something that's evolved over the years, my personal preferences. Having tried the vast majority of different filters over all these years, I've come to the conclusion that, like so many things in life, some of the simplest ideas are so often the best. Subsequently, I've always found myself coming back to very simple internal power filters. The ones I actually like the best are actually ones that are built into the back, or in this particular case, the corner of the aquarium. I'm not a great fan of internal filters which are stuck on the side with suckers, as these suckers tend to drive me crazy, as they almost inevitably fall off eventually, and invariably they do it when you're on holiday, and then you come back to a right old mess. One of the obvious things that I really like about this kind of filtration is because it's built into the inside of the tank, there's no chance of any leaks or anything from any hoses, and you also don't have the problem of all the pipes and hoses and things sort of hanging over the tank. Granted, you have a box at the back or in the corner of the tank, but I've never been bothered by that. I've always found that a neat black box is preferable to lots of pipes and things sort of dangling in the corner of a tank. But as I say, that's simply my preference and something that I've always sort of done, as it were. But one of the most important things that I've always found with filtration is the simplicity and ease of use is by far the most important factor for me, and much more so even than the actual aesthetics of it. And I know from experience that if something is difficult or overly complex to maintain, your natural inclination is not to do so. And this was very much apparent when I had my shop. Customers who had equipment which was overly complex or difficult to maintain were always by far the most likely to neglect their tanks. And sadly, many people end up leaving the hobby because of this. So I would definitely say, when you're choosing equipment, whether that be a filter or even the aquarium itself, always consider the simplicity and, most important of all, the ease of use. You honestly won't regret it. It really is that important. As I said in a previous video, an aquarium is for life, not just for Christmas. And if you have one that is really easy and simple to use and maintain, it really makes this something that's very viable and very possible to do. So I would always recommend keep things simple. That way you can just sit back and enjoy. Anyway, one of the things I always look for with a filter is something that has a really good large surface area, but with an actual quite a subtle sort of steady throw or throughput rather of water. Having a large filter surface area means that the sponges don't clog up too quickly, which is actually quite an important thing because it enables you to run the filter much longer without maintenance, or between maintenance as it were. This helps enormously to keep the sort of stability and the balance of the tank. The more you have to fiddle around with things, the more chance there is of kind of upsetting things. So the longer you can leave things for nature to just balance and settle things out for you, the more successful things will be. And that's certainly what I've always found over the years. I would go so far as to say that stability is essential for a healthy, trouble-free aquarium. And I would say it's probably the most important metric at the end of the day. Something also about the design of this kind of filter that I've always found very good and very helpful is the simple fact that the water flows downwards, actually through the sponges as it were. So it's actually flowing with gravity as it were, rather than against it. And because the sponges themselves are actually stacked on top of each other, there are two fine sponges at the bottom, and then stacked on top there's two coarser sponges. This actually works really well because the water has to gently make its way down with gravity, and gradually more and more particles get trapped, as well as actually just filtering your water biologically. You'll be surprised actually how many filters on the market actually draw water in sideways rather than with gravity. And although it may sound daft, it actually makes quite a big difference as to how efficient and how well a filter performs. It's one of those things that's incredibly overlooked, but if you can find a filter that works with gravity, I would definitely recommend going that way. And I would actually put most external filters actually in that category as well, although I prefer not to use them because of the plumbing and the potential leaks, as I said before. One of the other things I like about this kind of filtration is that the equipment is actually in the box itself. So the pump, which in this case is a simple power head that runs it, is actually within this box. So as I say, everything is just contained within this black box. There's nothing else actually in the tank itself. But because the pump is actually in the tank, it actually makes it very, very power efficient. This is because the pump isn't having to actually lift water like with a power filter that's external into the tank. It's literally just moving water around the tank, which enables you to use a very low wattage pump. I think this one's only about sort of 4 or 5 watts. So it's incredibly economic, which with today's electricity prices is definitely something you actually want to take into account. The actual pump itself is of a moderate size in terms of the actual flow rate. One of the things that I've kind of learned over the years is that with this kind of very natural low-tech style of aquarium, you don't really want or need a particularly high flow rate. And I normally go for something that circulates the entire volume of your tank only something like 2 or 3 times an hour. I find it's quite subtle and it works extremely well. Also, how you actually set up the pump and the outlet is one of those things which actually makes quite a difference, and is something that I've played around with a lot over the years. I always like to use quite a wide bored outlet so that the flow isn't actually overly aggressive. What you find with some pumps, the actual outlet nozzles are very sort of finely restricted, and what this does is makes the water flow much faster, and it gives you a very kind of directional, rather unnatural kind of flow. So what I really like to see rather than this is the whole actual water column just sort of gently drifting by. If you imagine just a sort of a gentle river with the water just slowly moving past you, not kind of random rapids of things blasted at high velocity. I've never been a fan of this, and I've never found it terribly helpful with this kind of aquarium anyway. As far as how you actually direct the actual flow, really what you want to set up, and certainly what I do anyway, is to set it up so that it has a gentle ripple on the surface, but not quite sufficient to actually break the surface. The beauty of this is it's perfectly sufficient to prevent surface films and things like that, but it also keeps it running silently, which is something that I really like. And being in a hard water area, spray from outlets tends to put limescale everywhere, so I tend to avoid that as well. And most important of all, it also gives you really good gas exchange, which is one of the most critical things to aquarium health. It also gives you a nice steady flow, as I was talking about earlier. And this steady flow should just sort of gently circulate right the way around the tank. And this should give you minimal sort of dead spots, which I think is quite an important thing, both for your fish and also for your plants, that they like a steady flow, but they don't really want to be in completely still water. I should also point out that this filter has 2 inlet grills. One is actually on the left-hand side of the box, which is sort of low down, drawing the water in from there. And the other one is actually on the front, which is actually sort of skimming the surface, as it were. And again, this helps to keep surface films and things to a minimum, which is again very good and healthy for the aquarium. But because the filter itself is basically just pumping water out and then it's flowing back in through gravity and then down through the sponges, the actual flow into the filter is really quite subtle. So there's no chance whatsoever, for example, of actually sucking a fish against the inlet vent, which is certainly a fault that I've seen with some kinds of filters over the years. Nevertheless, it is plenty of actual suction to actually take in fine particles and is able therefore to keep your water really crystal clear. But again, I do emphasise the fact that the water can flow gently down through the sponges definitely helps this. Another thing that I particularly enjoy about these filters is that the heater actually, again like the pump, is actually situated in the box, and it just slides in its own little compartment in the corner. One of the great things about the way this fits neatly into the box is that it's designed in such a way that the water is constantly passing the heating element before it actually is pumped back into the tank. This is great because it gives you a really good even heat distribution just as the flow goes around the tank. You don't have to worry about putting a heater in a part of the tank where there is flow to distribute it. So this I've always found works really well, and again it's lovely and tidy. Anyway, one of the things, because everything is built into the tank and most importantly is all underwater like this, it basically means that the tank runs almost silently, which is something that I really enjoy. I find that if a tank is silent running, it makes the tank really serene, and it's just such a relaxing thing to sit in front of a very quiet aquarium. You can always sort of play music like I do in some of my videos and just sit and watch the fish. It's a really nice thing to do. I know some people like to see bubbles in their tanks, but personally I find the noise spoils the effect. But I can equally see that some people find the bubbling actually quite soothing in its own way. But being in a hard water area, I'm a little bit allergic to bubbles because the lime scale that would be created all over the lid and the lights would drive me crazy. So I much prefer to use things that are actually pumped rather than air driven. The actual box itself contains, as I say, 2 fine sponges at the bottom, and then stacked on top of that are 2 coarse sponges. I do, however, occasionally add a wool pad actually onto the top of these sponges when needed, just really to polish the water if it actually needs it. But generally speaking, I've only found this necessary to do just after I've done some filter cleaning and the sponges are not actually trapping quite such fine particles. But as I say, the good thing about this setup is it enables me to run the filter really over quite long-term periods with absolutely minimal maintenance. I only actually clean any of the sponges when the flow itself starts to slow down. I don't have any set time scale on this. It's simply a matter of observing, and when the flow looks to be slightly impaired, then it's time to do a little bit of filter cleaning. My philosophy has always been a dirty filter is a much more efficient filter than a clean one, and I've always found that to hold true. So I only clean the foams, as I say, when the flow actually starts to become reduced. One thing I should point out, and I would always avoid if humanly possible, is never let a filter run until the flow has nearly stopped. You really want to keep it as constant as possible, and ideally you want to try and keep the flow pattern the same in the tank, sort of 24/7, 365 days a year. This will actually benefit your plants tremendously, as changing flow patterns force your plants to constantly adapt to new conditions, and you'll find you're much more likely to get algal problems in these changing conditions because your plants don't like it and tend to suffer. When I do decide this filter needs cleaning, I simply just clean the top 2 sponges, and this is generally, I would say, every 2 to 3 months on average, I would say. Because the tank is so incredibly mature and still has the 2 remaining fine foams below, I simply wash the top 2 foams under the tap. Traditionally, I've always washed filter foams in water that came from the tank, really just to try and preserve the filter microorganisms. But in all honesty, with this kind of aquarium, and especially one of this age, I've never had an issue washing half the sponges under the tap. But I would say, if in doubt, it's always a good idea to wash your filter foams in water that came out of the tank so as to preserve the microorganisms, and especially so if you don't have lots of foams in the tank. You've only got 1 or 2 that you can actually play with, as it were. The bottom sponges are probably only cleaned every year or 2, to be honest. Again, I have no actual set routine for this. I only actually clean the bottom sponges when I find I get into a situation where I've cleaned the top sponges and the flow is still impaired. which obviously means that the bottom ones are actually the guilty party rather than the top ones, as it were. But when I do this, I do tend to do those in water that came out of the tank because it would have meant disturbing all of the foams at the same time. As far as the media itself is concerned, it is just fine and coarse foam, as I say. There's nothing special. I don't use any absorbent filter media like carbon, zeolite, resins and all those kind of fancy things that you can buy. I much prefer to leave everything to nature. To my mind, using these kind of absorbent filter materials is always potentially counterproductive and a little bit unpredictable. This is because they selectively remove specific compounds from the water, which can lead to imbalances sort of in the natural order of things. Just as an example, activated carbon, for example, while it might make your water crystal clear, in the process it will actually remove certain plant nutrients. Whereas if you kind of flip it on its head and you don't use those kind of things and you just leave everything to nature, you'll find that you retain the natural balance of elements that are released by decomposition. And that's literally how nature works. When you start tampering and selectively removing things, you're potentially taking things sort of out of kilter, as it were. So it's something that I consciously always avoid doing, just on the off chance really, and it's always worked out fine for me. My filter basically filters through the biofilm that builds up on these foams, and obviously you have the biological activity of this, which is breaking down ammonia and nitrite, etc. But you'll find that as the biofilm gets thicker and thicker, it actually gradually collects finer and finer particles until the point where your filter foams are actually quite full of a mold-like material. And I've always found over the years that a foam that has got a good amount of this sort of material in it is by far the most efficient kind of filtering material. And it actually gives you really quite astonishing water clarity when you consider how simple it is. And you'll notice, despite the tank not having a meaningful water change since I think about 2010, the water in this tank is actually incredibly clear. And in fact, I'll actually just show you how clear the water is in this tank. If I just remove a jar of water out of the tank here and just sit it in front of a piece of white paper, you'll see that it's really quite remarkably clear when you think it's over a decade old and it hasn't been changed. So I think this is just testament to how well everything works. And I think it's an overall testament to the stability of this tank, the undisturbed nature of the filter and the substrate, but also having quite reasonable lighting helps. One of the things that a lot of people don't realise is that having quite reasonable lighting on a tank actually helps to degrade a lot of the things that can cause long-term water discoloration. You'll always find in poorly lit tanks, you're much more likely to get that kind of yellowing or sort of brown effect that you get in water. But there's lots of things at play. I would say that also the fact that a tank like this is nutrient limited probably contributes. If you think of it in terms of that nature wastes nothing, so the simple fact that the plants are absolutely scouring the water for any and everything they can get their hands on, I'm sure aids the actual clarity of things, because as I say, nothing is wasted, and if everything is used up, there's not much left to actually give you a sort of cloudy or discoloured water. Anyway, I'm sure there's something I wanted to say that I've forgotten, but I think I'll probably leave it here for now. Anyway, I'd be really interested to know what kind of filtration you will use and what kind of filtration that you actually prefer, because I'm sure everybody has different preferences on this. So I'd definitely be interested to hear. If you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water changed, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. And if you'd like to support this channel and help it reach more people, please share as well. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.